Welcome to the fourth episode of DIY CNC. So, this time we're going to be going over the process of making the first movement system. And what I started off by doing is cutting off a series of wooden planks. And these are basically those flat ball bearing holding planks that are going to allow us to align the ball bearings in order to better align the drive shaft. And here I am just in my basement using a small saw I picked up at Home Depot to slice this thin 1/2 inch thick wood that's about 3 inch by 3 inch. And here I am putting it on top of basically the CNC machine because I don't have a workbench, so I'm just using it as a workbench. And we're drilling 0.75 inch holes, 7/8 inch holes in this, as well as 1 inch holes through these large blocks of wood, so we can basically get a hole going all the way through the CNC machine from one end to one end, so that we can have a place for the drive shaft to exist. So this is me drilling a hole through one of these small pieces of wood, but I also drilled a hole through both ends of the actual frame so that the drive shaft could go all the way through from end to end. And overall, it wasn't perfect drilling on a workbench such as this, which is just a scrap piece of wood sitting on top of the machine. But once I had this, I started to actually put the ball bearing in. And I'm using JB Quick epoxy here, which is a great material. I had my window open for this to prevent the fumes, but basically you just put in the epoxy, and I have a whole jig set up where I basically clamped one of the ball bearings onto a rod onto my table so that I could just very neatly line it up, try to get the wood as perpendicular to the drive shaft as possible. I'm basically just making a fidget spinner here, but a really bad one. So once we have that, we screw it onto the frame, and as you can see, that ball bearing is right over the hole in the frame that I drilled before. So now, in theory, you could put a drive shaft all the way through from one end, through that ball bearing, and through another ball bearing on the other end, all the way through the frame, which is kind of the principle of how a CNC machine works, because you're using motors to spin this drive shaft to move each of the axes in whatever direction you want. So, here we go. The drive shaft went all the way through. Now, here I'm making the actual block that's going to move the build plate forward and back. So, it's a bad angle here, but you can see basically we just put a hole straight through this piece of wood. Now, we're going to put these types of nuts into it, which I have linked in the product list for all the things you need to buy if you want to build this. But it basically just created a block that we're able to move. So now, here we are putting the drive shaft in. We're using some lock nuts so that we can actually basically lock it into the ball bearing on one end. And then we're putting on this movement block. So this means we'll have the drive shaft fixed into one end of the ball bearings and just sitting loose in the other end of the ball bearings. And we'll be able to move this block of wood forward and back by spinning the drive shaft. We're just using a drill here, but later we'll be attaching actual motors. Here I am just fixing up, putting those nuts further in because they're a little awkward. And when you're putting it on the shaft, you have to be very careful because you have to make sure you don't push out the back end nut when you're screwing it on. So you want to make sure that the shaft threads perfectly through both nuts. And that's really just, you're going to put it in the first one and then be gentle by screwing it by hand all the way through. And we struggled for a bit because this is our first time ever doing this and we're just kind of figuring it out. But basically you see, we screw it in on the first end, and then we just very gently, by hand, turn it to get it all the way through. And once we get it all the way through, we're absolutely golden. Now, the thing you'll notice is, as I said before, we're only screwing it onto one of the ball bearings, because on one end, one ball bearing will have a lock nut on both ends, which are in the description of all the parts you need, and the other will just be loose. And this is to prevent unnecessary tension from popping out a ball bearing, which did happen to us once, which I didn't include. But it's needless to say, there was some trial and error in this. I don't really know how to build the CNC machine at this point, but now that I've gone through this, I'm letting you know. You only want to put the nuts on one side of the ball bearing. And there will be diagrams that are more specific in the actual how-to guide, but just letting you know. And you can see this is basically the concept. As I'm spinning this drill, well, the nut and this wooden block that's going to actually move everything is moving forward and back. So this is kind of our first proof of concept in the entire process. I felt very happy after this because, hey, it works. All we have to do is attach a wooden plate to that on some drawer sides, bada bing, bada boom, do it 3 more times, we have a CNC machine. this was a good day of work because we got a lot done, and I actually got to see what it would end up looking like. I apologize for the choppy video because I had some problems exporting it from my phone to my computer, but here's the project. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you all had a great time, and see you next time.